70. That number had weight. It wasn't just a birthday, it was the sum of a lifetime, carved out in long work weeks, aching joints, and memories that had gone soft around the edges, but never left me. I hadn't wanted a big celebration. Truth be told, I would have been happy with a quiet supper, maybe a slice of apple pie and a call from my daughter who lived out of state. But my son Jason insisted on throwing a party. He said it was time to do it right. The living room smelled of catered food and perfume. Balloons sagged in the corners, gold streamers taped to the mantel. Neighbors and relatives filled the space, voices bouncing off the walls I had painted myself 30 years ago. There were laughs, clinks of glasses, the sweet sting of champagne uncorked. I tried to smile, shaking hands, letting people clap me on the back. Jason stood at the center, glass in hand, soaking up the room's attention like he'd been born for it. He wore the tailored suit I'd never seen him buy, a flashy watch glinting under the chandelier. His wife lingered near the hors d'oeuvres, tossing me polite smiles without warmth. I lowered myself into the armchair, the same one where I used to rock Jason when he was small. My knees ached, but I held myself straight. Tonight was supposed to mean something. Jason tapped his glass with a fork. The chatter died down. He cleared his throat, a smirk already playing at the edge of his lips. Ladies and gentlemen, family, friends, we're here to celebrate my father, who has somehow managed to turn 70. Laughter rippled through the room. 70 years of life, 70 years of, well, let's call it stubbornness. I chuckled softly, trying to take it in stride. Stubbornness wasn't a bad thing. It's what had kept food on the table when layoffs swept through the plant. It's what made me patch roofs and fix fences instead of hiring someone I couldn't afford. But Jason's tone wasn't affectionate. It was cutting, dressed up as a joke. He raised his glass higher. Now, most of you know my dad. Quiet, steady, always hanging around. And tonight, well, let's be honest. He's only here for the cake. The room burst into laughter. Heads tilted back. Shoulders shook. Some laughed politely, others with the kind of sharpness that said they were following Jason's lead. Only here for the cake. The words sank like stones in my chest. I managed a thin smile, nodding as if I could laugh along. My hands stayed folded on my lap, fingers pressing into one another so hard my knuckles ached. I felt every eye flick toward me, gauging whether I'd join in the joke or sit there, the butt of it. My late wife, Margaret, would have stepped to my side, rested a hand on my shoulder, and said something to soften the moment. She had that gift. But she was gone, and all I had was the memory of her voice. Hold your head high, Frank. Dignity can't be stolen. Jason downed his glass, still grinning. 70 years and still kicking. Let's cut the cake before he falls asleep on us. More laughter. The crowd shifted toward the dining table, clapping Jason on the back like he was the man of the hour. I rose slowly, heart hammering, and followed. The cake sat there, white frosting and 7 tall candles lined up across the top, their flames trembling. I stared at them a moment, letting the heat sting my face. When I leaned to blow them out, I made no wish. Wishes were for children and fools. What I felt instead was the weight of years of sacrifice. Mortgages paid, bills settled late, but settled all the same. A house raised board by board with my own hands. And here I was, reduced to a punchline. I sat through the rest of the evening quietly, smiling when needed, accepting hollow congratulations. But inside, something shifted. The laughter had done more than sting. It had cut deep, carving a space where anger and resolve could settle. By the time the last guest drifted out and Jason clapped me on the shoulder, "Great party, Dad, right?" I had already made a silent promise. I wouldn't answer him with anger tonight. I wouldn't shout, wouldn't fight, wouldn't beg for respect. But one day soon, Jason would learn that I wasn't only here for the cake. I was here for everything he thought he already owned. The night after my birthday party, the house felt strangely hollow. The streamers still clung to the mantel. A few half-deflated balloons bumped along the ceiling, and paper plates with crumbs of frosting sat abandoned on the counter. Jason and his wife had left without helping clean up. No surprise there. I lowered myself into the old armchair, the same spot I'd sat when Jason was a boy, small enough to curl into my lap while I read him bedtime stories. My knees ached as they always did after a long day on my feet, but tonight the ache went deeper, down into the part of me that used to feel proud. Only here for the cake. The words replayed in my mind like a bad record. The laughter of my guests still echoed faintly in my ears. I closed my eyes and saw Margaret, her smile soft, but her eyes steady, the way she used to look at me when life got heavy. She would have put her hand on my arm that night, whispered, "Don't let him see it hurt, Frank. Some wounds you let the years carry." But Margaret wasn't here. She'd been gone almost 8 years now. I kept her photograph on the mantel, a black and white print from our early days when I was just a young man in work boots, and she was in a plain summer dress. Back then, we didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough to build a life. I thought about the years that followed, the sacrifices etched into every beam of this house. Double shifts at the steel plant when layoffs swept through. Nights I came home with my hands raw, Margaret waiting with a basin of warm water to ease the sting. I remembered patching leaks in the roof with Jason at my side, handing me nails from a bucket, his face smudged with dirt but lit with pride. What happened to that boy? Where did the respect go? The answer, if I was honest, had been creeping for years. The bigger his paycheck grew, the less space he seemed to leave for me. New car, new suits, fancy friends who never looked twice my way. Somewhere along the line, I had gone from father to background noise, a relic he trotted out at holidays but never really saw. I rose and shuffled to the bookshelf in the corner. Wedged between old manuals and Margaret's cookbooks was a ledger, the same brown notebook we'd kept for decades. Inside were records of every payment made on this house, every bond we bought instead of taking vacations, every repair Margaret and I had done ourselves. Pages inked with sacrifice, each line proof that nothing here had been handed to me. I traced my finger along one page. 1985, mortgage payment, final, paid in full. I remembered that night. Margaret and I sat at the same kitchen table, 2 mugs of coffee between us, laughing at the idea that we finally owned something no one could take away. Jason was just a boy then, asleep upstairs, unaware that the walls around him were held up by sweat, not luck. And now? That same boy thought of me as a burden, a prop for his jokes, waiting for the day he could claim what I had built. I snapped the ledger shut and pressed it to my chest. The humiliation at my birthday party had lit a fire, but this book, it gave the fire purpose. Every line told me I was not dead weight. I was the foundation. I set the book back on the shelf, slower than I had taken it out. Then I turned toward the window, where the moonlight spilled across the yard I'd mowed for half a century. The grass still needed trimming, the fence needed paint, but it was mine, and I wasn't about to let mockery erase that truth. Margaret's voice echoed again, calm but firm. Respect isn't given, it's kept. Don't let him think he's already taken what's yours. I sat down once more, the house quiet around me, and I realized that Jason's careless toast had given me something he never intended, a reminder. This wasn't just a house, this was my life's work, and if he thought he could laugh me into a corner until it became his, he was in for a lesson. The shadows in the room stretched long, but I didn't feel small anymore. I felt steady, like the beams in these walls. I whispered into the silence, "You'll see, son. You'll see soon enough." 2 weeks after that birthday party, I found myself invited to Sunday dinner at Jason's place. He called it keeping traditions alive. I knew better. It was about appearances. He liked to show the neighbors that he still had a hand in family duty, even if his heart wasn't in it. When I arrived, the house smelled of rosemary chicken and roasted potatoes. The table stretched long, polished wood gleaming under the chandelier. Plates were set neatly in pairs down both sides, wine glasses sparkling at each place. Jason's friends were there again, the ones who had laughed the loudest at his birthday toast. His wife flitted from seat to seat, pouring drinks, offering smiles thin as paper. I stood near the doorway, coat still in hand, scanning the table. That's when I noticed. There was no chair for me. Every spot was taken. Plates set, napkins folded, glasses filled. At the head of the table sat Jason, raising his wine glass as though I wasn't even there. For a moment, I thought perhaps they had simply forgotten, that someone would notice and shuffle a seat. But the silence stretched. No one moved. "Dad?" Jason finally said, his tone almost mocking. "You're here." "Good, good. Why don't you make yourself comfortable over there?" He gestured vaguely toward the corner, where a small stool leaned against the wall near the piano. A stool. The room chuckled politely, but I felt the sting behind their laughter. My hands tightened around the coat in my grip. I'd worked 40 years to provide for this man, sacrificed vacations, broken my back to keep a roof over his head. And here I was, an afterthought, shunted off to the side like a piece of unwanted furniture. I carried the stool to the edge of the table, sat down stiffly, and rested my coat over my lap. From that low perch, I looked up at the others, their heads bent together, laughter spilling around me as though I weren't part of it. My plate arrived last, a small portion of chicken, a thin slice of bread. Jason raised his glass. "To family," he said. The words rang hollow, sour in the air. I watched them eat and drink, their conversations circling around vacations I'd never taken, cars I'd never driven, deals struck in offices I'd never seen. And all the while, I sat on that stool, my knees aching, my pride aching worse. But I didn't let them see it. Instead, I studied Jason carefully, noting how he gestured too broadly, laughed too loudly, as if masking something. He was putting on a show, not just for his friends, but maybe for himself. That's when a thought struck me. His confidence was too polished, too brittle. Beneath it, there was fear. Later, when the plates were cleared, I excused myself quietly. Jason barely glanced up, but as I stepped out into the cool night air, I made myself another silent vow. This wasn't just disrespect anymore, it was erasure. He wanted me invisible. But a man who built the very walls around him can't be erased so easily. I walked home under the streetlights, my breath fogging in the cold. Every step seemed to echo with Margaret's words, carried from memory. "Don't fight fire with fire, Frank. Just wait. Time has a way of burning what's hollow." That night, I set the ledger back on the kitchen table. I flipped to the page with the mortgage stamped, paid in full, and laid my hand flat across it. The paper felt warm, alive almost. It whispered a truth Jason had forgotten. This house, this life, had never been his to claim. The stool in the corner had been an insult, but it had also given me clarity. Jason thought I had no seat at the table. Soon he would learn I owned the table itself. The following Friday, the knock on my front door came just as the evening news droned in the background. I wasn't expecting anyone. Most days the house stayed quiet, my only company the clock on the wall and the creak of the floorboards when I moved from kitchen to chair. When I opened the door, there he was, Peter Lawson, broad-shouldered, hair more silver than I remembered, his old bomber jacket zipped up against the cold. We'd worked side by side at the plant for 30 years, two men who knew what it meant to break a sweat before dawn. Retirement had drifted us apart, as it often does, but seeing him on my porch stirred something warm in my chest. "Frank," he said with a grin, "you gonna make me stand out here and freeze? Or are you still civilized enough to invite an old friend inside?" I chuckled and stepped aside. "Come in, Pete. You're just in time. Coffee's still hot." We settled into the kitchen. He looked around at the familiar walls, the cabinets Margaret had painted a lifetime ago. His eyes softened when they landed on her picture by the mantel. He didn't say anything, just gave me a nod, the kind men share when words would only bruise. We talked for a while, about his grandkids, the aches in his knees, the weather that never seemed to make up its mind. But eventually he leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You don't look right, Frank," he said, his voice steady. "Not sick, not tired. Different. What's going on?" I hesitated, but something about Peter's gaze, the same one that used to cut through a man's bluff on the line, made me tell the truth. I told him about the birthday party, about Jason's cruel toast, about sitting on a stool at dinner like an unwanted guest. I even admitted the part that stung the most, that I'd smiled through it, pretending not to care, while inside I felt erased. When I finished, the kitchen fell quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Peter shook his head slowly. "Jason always thought he was the clever one," he muttered. "But clever runs out when respect isn't in the mix. He's forgotten who built the ground he's standing on." I rubbed a hand across my face. Maybe I should have said something. Maybe I let him walk too far over me. Peter leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You did what a father does. You held steady. But don't confuse patience with weakness. You're not finished, Frank. You've got more strength left than he's ever had." I frowned. "Strength doesn't count for much when you're sitting alone with old papers." He tapped the table with one thick finger. "Old papers. Those papers are your life's proof. Mortgages paid, deeds signed, sweat turned into bricks. Jason may laugh, but you and Margaret built something solid. That ledger you keep? That's not just ink, that's power. Don't let him forget it." I looked at him then, really looked. Peter wasn't the type to sugarcoat. If he said there was still fight in me, maybe he saw something I'd forgotten. "You think I should do something?" I asked quietly. "I think," Peter said, "you should remember this. Dignity isn't begging for a seat at someone else's table. It's owning the table. And if Jason thinks you've already handed him the keys, maybe it's time he found out you're still the one holding them." The words sank deep. I thought of Margaret, of the mortgage slip marked "paid in full," of Jason's smirk when he raised his glass. I felt a quiet stirring in my chest, not hot anger this time, but something steadier. I poured us each another cup of coffee. "Maybe you're right, Pete. Maybe it's time Jason learned who's carrying who." Peter grinned, the lines around his eyes deepening. "There's the Frank I know. Don't let a fool write the ending to your story." That night, after he left, I sat alone with the ledger open before me. For the first time since that cruel birthday toast, I didn't feel like a man mocked or discarded. I felt like a man who had been reminded of his foundation. Jason thought he'd buried me under laughter, but he'd only built the stage for his own fall. The next morning, I cleared the kitchen table of everything but the ledger. The house was quiet, the air still carrying the faint scent of coffee from the night before. Margaret's picture on the mantel caught the soft winter light, and for a moment it felt as though she was watching me, waiting to see if I would finally open the book and face what it meant. I slid a hand across the cracked leather cover. This notebook had been with us through nearly 4 decades. It wasn't fancy, just a brown ledger with ruled lines, but it held the sum of our lives. Every mortgage payment, every savings bond, every repair logged in Margaret's neat handwriting. It was proof that nothing we had was given. It was all built, paid for, earned with blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. I turned the pages slowly. 1979, mortgage payment, first installment, paid with overtime wages. I remembered those nights, staggering home from the plant with my hands blackened from steel dust, Margaret leaving a plate in the oven to keep it warm. 1985, new roof shingles, bought instead of vacation. Jason had been 6 then. He wanted to go to the shore. Margaret and I promised him next year. Next year never came, but the roof never leaked again. 1992, paid in full, mortgage closed. I could see us sitting at this same table that night, 2 mugs of coffee between us, Margaret smiling so wide her eyes crinkled. She kissed the paper slip like it was treasure, and it was. Every page was a reminder that this house wasn't just a structure. It was a living ledger of sacrifice. Jason saw walls. I saw years. He thought of inheritance. I thought of sweat. As I traced Margaret's handwriting, a thought sharpened. Jason believed he had already inherited this house in spirit, that I was simply a caretaker until he was ready to claim it. But that was his mistake. Ownership wasn't about bloodlines, it was about responsibility. And responsibility was something he had never carried. I flipped further. In the back pocket of the ledger were folded documents, a property tax receipt, an old insurance policy, even the warranty for the furnace I replaced 15 years ago. All proof, all in my name. For the first time, I began to see the shape of a plan. Peter's words echoed in my ears. Dignity isn't begging for a seat at someone else's table. It's owning the table. If Jason wanted to mock me, to erase me, let him laugh. He was laughing while standing on the very foundation I had built. And if he thought that foundation was already his, then it was time I reminded him, legally, visibly, unmistakably, whose name was written in ink on every page. I stacked the papers neatly, folded the ledger shut, and set it on the table like a hammer ready to be swung. The anger from the birthday party still simmered, but now it wasn't wild, it was focused, sharpened by every line of that notebook. Margaret's voice seemed to drift through the quiet. "Don't push what's already leaning, Frank. Just be ready when it falls." I whispered back, "I'll be ready." The stool at Jason's table had been an insult. The laughter at my birthday had been a wound. But this ledger, that was the cure, the weapon, the proof. I poured myself another coffee, steadied my hand, and looked once more at the neat letters of my wife's handwriting. Then I began to plan. Jason thought I was finished. He had no idea I was just beginning. A week later, I drove past Jason's place on my way back from the post office. His driveway was cluttered with a new SUV, shining black paint still carrying the dealer's tag, parked right beside his wife's luxury sedan. The garage door was open, stacked with boxes of things they'd bought but hadn't bothered to unpack. Flat-screen televisions, brand new patio furniture still in plastic, a treadmill collecting dust before it had ever seen a jog. I slowed the truck and shook my head. Jason always had an appetite for more than his plate could hold. That SUV alone could have eaten half his annual salary. He liked the shine, the show, the applause from neighbors. But bills, I knew, weren't impressed by applause. Later that week, I stopped by Henderson's Cafe for coffee. Linda, who knew everyone's business whether she asked to or not, leaned over the counter and whispered, "You hear about Jason?" She didn't wait for my answer. Word is the bank's been calling. Mortgage behind. Car loan late before the ink's dry. I stirred my coffee slowly. "That's so?" She nodded. "Man's living like there's no reckoning day." I didn't let on how the news struck me. Inside, though, gears began to turn. That evening I walked the perimeter of my own yard, the grass brittle underfoot, the fence slats I had hammered with Margaret still standing strong after decades. I compared it to Jason's restless hunger for what he hadn't earned. He believed my house was already his by destiny, but his own? It was a castle of cards. The cracks became clearer with each passing day. A neighbor mentioned seeing a repossession truck circle Jason's street one morning. Another said Jason's wife had complained at the salon about tight cash flow while still booking her next trip. Even Ruth, a woman who used to handle dispatch at the old plant, told me she'd been stiffed on a catering bill after providing food for one of Jason's parties. I didn't gloat, I listened. And every story confirmed what I already suspected. Jason's kingdom was built on sand. One night, I pulled the ledger back out, laying Jason's debts in my mind beside my own pages of paid in full. The contrast was stark. Margaret and I had built slow, careful, steady. Jason chased shine, paying tomorrow for things he couldn't afford today. For the first time since his cruel toast, I felt a quiet sense of leverage. He thought me powerless, a burden, a punchline at his table. But the truth was, he was the one already drowning. All I had to do was stand steady and watch the water rise. Margaret's words came back again, soft but sure. Don't push what's already leaning, Frank. Just be ready when it falls. And Jason's house. It was leaning badly. I closed the ledger, a plan forming clearer in my mind. I didn't need to shout or confront him with anger. His own arrogance was doing the work for me. My task was simpler. When the cracks turned into a collapse, I would be there, calm, prepared, ledger in hand. Jason thought I was a relic, a man counting candles on a cake. He didn't realize I was counting cracks in the walls of the life he thought was unshakable. And soon enough, those cracks would bring the house down. The following Monday, I put on my best jacket, a brown corduroy that Margaret used to press for me on Sundays, and drove into town. The sky hung low with gray clouds, the kind that looked heavy but never opened up. It suited my mood. I wasn't rushing, but I wasn't wandering either. I had a destination. The brass plate on the office door read, Samuel Whitaker, attorney at law. Sam and I went back a long way. He was a few years younger than me, but we'd met through the plant's union decades earlier. Back then, he'd been the lawyer who showed up in wrinkled suits and spoke plain English to men who hated contracts. Time had seasoned him, but he was still the sort who'd look you in the eye and give you the truth without sugar. Inside, the office smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with red binders and boxes. Sam stood from behind his desk, his frame lean, his hair thinning, but his handshake firm. "Franklin Ward," he said with a grin. "I heard about your birthday. 70, huh? Congratulations." I smiled thinly. "Thank you, Sam. Though I'll admit the party wasn't exactly the gift it should have been." He gestured for me to sit. "What can I do for you?" I placed the ledger on his desk, along with a small stack of folded documents. Tax receipts, insurance papers, and a certified copy of the deed. Sam leafed through them, eyebrows raising. "Looks like you've kept things in good order." "Margaret insisted," I said softly. "But I'm here because my son, well, he's got it in his head that this house is his already. He's been treating me like I'm a guest in my own life. I need to know what's true, on paper." Sam leaned back, fingers steepled. "Frank, this property is yours outright. Paid off, taxes current, insurance valid. Legally, no one else has a claim unless you hand it over." "That's what I thought," I murmured. "But Jason's been reckless. Buying cars, throwing parties, living loud. I've heard whispers of debts. I don't want his mess touching what Margaret and I built." Sam nodded. "It can't. Not if you don't sign anything away. In fact," he pulled a file closer, scribbling a note. "If you ever wanted to transfer or sell, you're within your rights. You could liquidate tomorrow if you chose." I sat with that thought for a moment. Jason believed time was on his side, that patience would deliver him my home. But Sam had just confirmed what I needed to hear. The deed, the decision, the power. It was mine. "Suppose," I said carefully, "a man wanted to make sure his children couldn't touch something they hadn't earned. Suppose he wanted to protect his work from being wasted." Sam's eyes narrowed slightly, but not in judgment, just focus. "Then that man would take steps to secure it. There are trusts, transfers, sales. Depends on how sharp you want to cut." I tapped the ledger, sharp enough that mockery doesn't carry the day. He studied me a long moment, then nodded. "All right, then we'll talk options. Quietly. No one needs to know until you're ready." For the next hour, he walked me through scenarios. Protective trusts, conditional clauses, outright sale. Each one felt like a hammer laid out on a workbench, waiting for the right swing. When I rose to leave, Sam shook my hand firmly. "Frank, you've got more strength left than most men half your age. Use it wisely. Don't let arrogance undo what you've built." Outside, the clouds had shifted, a sliver of sunlight breaking through. I tucked the papers under my arm and headed for the truck. Jason thought my silence meant surrender. But silence, I realized, could be preparation. And now I had the law on my side. 2 days after my meeting with Sam Whitaker, I drove to the bank. The old brick building stood on Main Street, its clock tower chiming noon as I pulled into the lot. I'd been walking through those doors since Margaret and I scraped together our first down payment. The faces inside had changed, but the smell of polished wood and paper ink was the same. Behind the counter stood Martha Ellison, a woman I'd known since she was a teller fresh out of school. Now she wore a manager's badge and the kind of glasses that said she'd seen every trick in the book. She smiled when she saw me. "Well, Mr. Ward," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "what brings you in today?" I leaned against the counter. "Need to ask a few questions." "Quiet questions." She raised an eyebrow. "Confidential?" "Very." She led me into her office, closed the door, and sat with a pen poised over a yellow pad. "All right, Frank, what's on your mind?" I set the ledger on her desk, but didn't open it. I've heard rumors about my son. Cars bought on loans, mortgage payments missed, creditors circling. I don't want gossip. I want the truth. Martha sighed, then tapped her pen. "You know I can't disclose another customer's account, Frank." "I know," I said evenly, "but I've been a customer here longer than Jason's been alive. And I'll say this. If his problems touch me, I need to know before it's too late." She studied me a moment, then leaned back. "I can't give you numbers, but I can tell you this. The house he lives in, second mortgage, payments behind, the SUV in his driveway, already flagged for delinquency, credit cards, maxed. And last week we got notice of a lien from a vendor. He's juggling, Frank, and he's running out of hands." I let the information settle. It wasn't joy I felt. It was clarity. "Thank you," I said quietly. Martha folded her hands. "Frank, I'll be blunt. Jason's living like the rules don't apply. But they do. And when the reckoning comes, it'll be public. He could lose everything." I nodded slowly. "And if that happens?" She gave me a small, almost knowing smile. "Then someone with steady funds and a clean record could pick up what's left at auction. A man like you." Her words were plain, but they struck like a hammer. Sam had shown me the legal tools. Martha had shown me the financial cracks. Together they painted a picture Jason would never want to see. But I did. I rose, shaking her hand. "You've given me enough. More than enough." On the way out, I passed a bulletin board near the lobby. Notices pinned up, estate sales, small auctions, foreclosure listings. I didn't need to read them. I knew Jason's name would be on one soon enough if he kept down this road. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. For years, I had thought silence meant being invisible, but now I saw it differently. Silence was cover. Silence was preparation. Jason had mocked me in front of friends, sat me on a stool at his table, called me nothing but dead weight. But the truth was turning. His debts were heavy. My record was clean. His arrogance was loud. My patience was steady. And when the day came that the bank called in its dues, only one of us would have the means to answer. I climbed into my truck, set the ledger on the passenger seat, and started the engine. Margaret's words drifted back to me, as if carried on the hum of the motor. "Don't push what's already leaning, Frank. Just wait." I gripped the wheel and whispered, "I'm waiting, and I'm ready." The knowledge from Sam and Martha weighed on me, but it wasn't a burden, it was a tool. For the first time in years, I felt steadier than Jason. He had his fancy cars, his dinners, his friends who laughed at the cruel jokes. I had the ledger, the law, and patience. That was enough to begin. I started small. At night, I sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's old reading lamp, casting a circle of light on the pages. The ledger lay open beside fresh sheets of paper. I began drafting lists the way I used to plan overtime shifts, clear, simple, deliberate. List 1, Day 1, call Luis from the plant. He'd moved into hauling freight years ago and always needed reliable partners. Ruth Collins, best dispatcher I'd ever known. If I needed to run routes again, she'd know which ones to keep and which to cut. A local realtor who owed me a favor for fast signatures if property shifted hands. List 2, Don't touch. No image consultants. No borrowed money. No shortcuts. Each note steadied me. Jason thrived on flash, but I would build with foundation. I spent afternoons visiting old contacts. Over coffee at Henderson's, I asked Ruth how business was. She laughed bitterly. Falling apart. Companies are cutting corners. Drivers aren't getting paid on time. Nobody answers the phones after Thursday. She shook her head. It's a mess. I didn't say what I was planning. I only asked if she'd take a call from me if things shifted. She looked me in the eye, her expression firm. For you, Frank, always. Luis was the same. I found him elbow deep in an engine at his yard. When I mentioned the possibility of new ownership, he wiped his hands on a rag and grinned. You bring honesty back, I'll work with you. I'm tired of bosses who think a truck runs on lies. At the bank, Martha discreetly helped me prepare the practical side. We sat in her office one evening after hours, reviewing options. I signed forms to consolidate my accounts, pulled certificates of deposit that had been sitting since Margaret's time, and arranged for cashier's checks that could be ready within a day's notice. Each paper slid into a folder that grew heavier by the week. I made copies of every important document, deed, insurance, tax receipts, and stored them in a fireproof box. Another set went into the safe deposit box at the bank. If Jason ever tried to claim I was confused or incapable, I'd have proof ready. The days passed quietly, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt charged, like a wire humming with current. Jason continued his life of showy dinners and unpaid bills. I continued my preparations with calm steps and no wasted motion. At night, I'd sit by Margaret's photograph and read a line from the ledger out loud, as if to remind myself of what we'd built together. One evening, I found myself whispering, 1985, new shingles, bought instead of vacation. I smiled softly. We made the right trade, love, and now it's going to protect more than just a roof. By the end of the month, I had everything ready. Allies lined up, funds consolidated, papers in order. All that was left was to wait for Jason's world to collapse under its own weight, and when it did, I wouldn't gloat. I wouldn't shout. I would simply step forward, steady and prepared, and claim what was mine. Jason thought my silence meant weakness. But silence, I realized, was the loudest preparation of all. The notice came the way storms do, sudden but not unexpected. A thin envelope from the county clerk's office, stamped and sealed, arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday afternoon. Inside, typed in plain black letters, was confirmation. Foreclosure auction. Dalton property. Saturday, 11 a.m. Jason's name sat there in ink, not rumor. His debts had ripened. The reckoning had arrived. I set the envelope on the table beside my ledger. For a long while, I simply stared at it, the way a man studies a crossroads before taking the turn he's been waiting for. Margaret's picture on the mantel seemed to watch too, her soft smile steady as if to say, Now, Frank, this is where patience pays. Saturday morning, I dressed with care, not in my work clothes, but in the navy blazer Margaret had once bought for a niece's wedding. I polished my boots until the leather shone. My hands shook just a little as I tucked the cashier's checks into the inside pocket of my coat. They felt heavy, like anchors pulling me forward. The courthouse conference room smelled of old carpet and dust, lined with folding chairs filled with bidders, scrapmen, small-time investors, a few curious locals. At the front, a clerk read the ground rules. Certified funds only, payment due immediately, property sold as is. No theatrics, no applause, just the law. I sat near the back, folder in hand, expression calm. Jason arrived late, 10 minutes after the start, his suit jacket wrinkled, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He didn't carry a folder, didn't even sit down. He stood near the wall, arms crossed, eyes darting. He wasn't there to save his home. He was there to see if I would fail. The clerk began with smaller lots, equipment, liens, a rental property Jason had taken out against his name. Bids rose and fell, gavels tapped, papers exchanged. I waited. My time would come. Finally, the clerk cleared his throat. Next lot. Primary residence, including house and land, located on Maple Drive. The room shifted. A couple of bidders glanced at their notes, but none looked eager. A family home weighed heavier than a warehouse. It wasn't easy money. Opening bid, the clerk announced. 50,000? Silence. Then I raised my hand. 50. The clerk nodded. 50. Do I hear 60? One man in a flannel shirt muttered a bid. I countered. Another bidder lifted his card half-heartedly, but I went higher without pause. The increments climbed, steady, inevitable. My heart thudded like a hammer in my chest, but my hand was steady each time I raised it. At 90,000, the flannel man shook his head. At 100, the half-hearted bidder set his card down. 100,000, the clerk called. His eyes swept the room. Do I hear any advance? Silence. From the back wall, Jason's voice cut through, sharp but hollow. This is ridiculous. That's my house. The clerk didn't flinch. Sir, unless you're here with certified funds, you may not bid. All eyes turned toward Jason. He shifted, face burning, but said nothing more. The gavel struck wood. Sold 100,000 to bidder number 12. My number. I let out a slow breath, the tension bleeding out with it. In that moment, I didn't feel triumph or spite. I felt something cleaner, justice settling like dust after a storm. The clerk handed me the paperwork to sign. My pen didn't tremble as I wrote my name across the line. The ink was bold, permanent, undeniable. Across the room, Jason watched, his jaw tight, his eyes a storm of disbelief. He had laughed at me, mocked me, sat me on a stool at his table. And now, before strangers, and the law itself, the house he thought was his, slipped into my hands without a sound. I folded the papers carefully, tucked them into my coat, and stood. The room murmured behind me, but I heard only Margaret's voice. Hold your head high, Frank. Dignity can't be stolen. I walked past Jason on my way out. He glared, fists clenched, but didn't speak. I paused just long enough to meet his eyes and said softly, Cake doesn't buy a roof, son. Then I stepped into the crisp afternoon air, the deed secure in my pocket, the weight of humiliation gone at last. Monday morning, the courthouse smelled of floor polish and ink. The clerk from the auction greeted me with a polite nod and slid a stack of documents across the counter. No crowd this time, no laughter or whispers, just the quiet machinery of the law doing its work. I removed my glasses, set them on the desk, and read each page slowly. Transfer of ownership, certificate of sale, title, recording. Every line bore Jason's name, scratched out, replaced by mine in bold type. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed, steady as a man driving a final nail into a frame he had built himself. With each stroke, I felt the weight of Jason's mockery lift from my shoulders. The dead weight joke at my birthday, the stool shoved into the corner at his table, the whispers behind my back, each signature turned them to ash. The clerk gathered the papers, stamped them with a red seal that thudded against the desk, and slid the deed toward me. Congratulations, Mr. Ward. It's official. The property is yours. I picked it up carefully. The paper was thin, ordinary, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Margaret's handwriting in the ledger, her voice urging patience, her sacrifices, all of it now inked into this single sheet. On my way out, I passed the courthouse steps, where lawyers smoked their morning cigarettes. Jason leaned against the far wall, tie askew, eyes bloodshot. He hadn't gone inside. He didn't need to. The outcome was already carved in stone. When he saw me, he pushed off the wall, fury in every step. You think this is funny, old man? That was my house. I stopped, turned slowly, and held the deed at my side. No, Jason, I said calmly. It was never yours. You gambled with money you didn't have. I just picked up what you threw away. His jaw clenched, shoulders rising as if he might strike. But then he saw the official seal on the deed, the bold black ink of my name, and the fight drained from him. Pride makes men shout. Truth makes them silent. I didn't gloat. I didn't sneer. I simply walked past him, boots steady on the courthouse stone. At home, I placed the deed beside Margaret's photograph on the mantel. For the first time since my birthday, the house felt lighter, the silence no longer bitter. I poured myself a glass of water, raised it in a quiet toast, and whispered, "We're still here, love, still standing." Jason had laughed that I was only there for the cake, but today, with the deed in my hand, I knew the truth. I wasn't the cake. I was the foundation. And now, legally, undeniably, the house stood on my name, alone. 2 days after the deed was signed, I walked up the path to the Maple Drive house. The morning air was crisp, a pale sun shining over the lawn where Jason's SUV had once sat proudly. Now the driveway was empty, the garage door hanging crooked from neglect. I carried the keys the clerk had handed me, their metal edges cool against my palm. They jingled softly, a music that spoke louder than any toast Jason had ever raised. For decades, I had walked this same path as a visitor, treated like a guest in what Jason claimed as his kingdom. But today, I wasn't a guest. I was the owner. I slid the key into the lock. The door opened with a creak, and the scent of stale perfume and spilled wine drifted out. Inside, the place bore the marks of careless living. Take-out boxes stacked by the counter, wine glasses left unwashed, bills tossed unopened on a side table. The walls, once painted carefully by Margaret and me when we first helped Jason move in, were scuffed and chipped. I stepped into the living room, the same spot where Jason had stood on my birthday, glass in hand, mocking me in front of guests. "He's only here for the cake." The words echoed in my memory, but the room was empty now. His laughter was gone, replaced by silence that belonged to me. The kitchen told the rest of the story. Appliances shining but unpaid for, receipts crumpled under magnets, notices tucked into drawers. I opened one letter at random. Final notice, delinquent payment. Jason had been drowning, and rather than ask for help, he'd sneered at the very man who could have steadied him. I walked down the hallway, each step heavier with memory. Family photos still hung crooked. Jason in his cap and gown, Jason at his wedding, Jason holding his first newborn. I paused at one frame that included me, younger and smiling, Jason at my side. For a moment, I saw the boy I had raised, the boy who used to hand me nails when I fixed the roof, who once said he wanted to be just like me. But that boy was long gone, replaced by a man who thought greed could buy respect. I reached the study at the back of the house. Jason had turned it into an office of sorts. Piles of unpaid bills, glossy brochures for vacations, credit card statements spread across the desk. In the corner, his leather chair sat like a throne, cracked at the seams. I lowered myself into it. The chair groaned under my weight, but it held. For a long moment, I simply sat, letting the silence fill me. Jason had wanted me invisible, pushed to stools in corners, mocked for being old, useless, dead weight. But here I was, seated at the heart of his house, not as a guest, but as the rightful owner. The front door banged open suddenly. Jason's voice rang out, sharp and strained. "Dad, you can't just walk in here." I turned slowly in the chair as he stormed down the hallway. His tie was loose, his hair disheveled, eyes wild. He stopped short when he saw me seated in what had been his chair. "This isn't your place anymore," I said quietly, holding up the deed from my pocket. "It's mine. Legally, signed, sealed, and stamped. You had your chance. You wasted it." His mouth opened, but no words came. His fists clenched at his sides. You planned this." "No, Jason," I said evenly. "You planned your own downfall. I just stepped in when you left the door wide open." For a moment, I thought he might lunge, but instead he sagged, shoulders folding under the weight of reality. His pride had propped him up for years, but now even that couldn't keep him standing tall. I rose from the chair, slipped the deed back into my coat, and walked past him. At the doorway, I paused. "You mocked me for being here for the cake. But remember this, son. The the cake. Disappears in a night. The foundation lasts a lifetime, and you lost yours. I left him there, rooted in the ruins of his arrogance, while I stepped back into the crisp morning air. The keys jingled in my pocket again, but now they didn't sound like music. They sounded like justice. Jason showed up at my doorstep 3 nights later. The knock wasn't polite. It rattled the frame, loud enough to wake the neighborhood. I opened the door to find him standing there, face flushed, eyes bloodshot, shirt half untucked. He looked less like the polished man from my birthday party and more like a gambler who'd bet everything and lost. "Dad," he said, voice sharp, "we need to talk." I let the silence hang before answering. "Do we?" He pushed past me into the living room without waiting for permission, the same room where Margaret and I had celebrated Christmases, Thanksgivings, birthdays. He stood beneath her photograph on the mantel, pacing like a caged animal. "You stole my house," he spat. I closed the door behind him. "You lost your house, Jason. I simply picked it up before strangers did." His fists tightened at his sides. "Do you have any idea how humiliated I am? My wife, her family, they're all talking. Everyone knows." I met his gaze steadily. "Humiliation is the echo of arrogance, son. You built it yourself." He shook his head, almost laughing. "You planned this. Sat back, waiting for me to fall so you could look like the hero." "No," I said calmly. "I planned to grow old in peace. You planned your downfall when you mocked me at my own birthday, when you put me on a stool at your table, when you treated me like an old man waiting to hand you the keys. I didn't take anything from you. You gave it away." His face twisted. "You think this makes you better than me? That you're some noble martyr with your ledger and your speeches?" I stepped closer, not raising my voice. "I don't need to be better than you, Jason. I just needed to remember who I am. I am the man who built the roof over your head, who paid every bill, who held this family steady while you learned to walk. And when you mocked me as dead weight, you only revealed the truth, that you've been leaning on me all along." He opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes darted to Margaret's picture, and for a moment I saw shame flicker there. "Jason," I said quietly, "respect isn't owed. It's earned. You wanted to inherit without sacrifice, to sit at a table you never built. Life doesn't work that way. You can mock me, erase me from your parties, but the deed doesn't lie. The house is mine because I carried the weight you never could." He sagged, shoulders collapsing as though the fight had drained out of him. "So what now?" he muttered. "You kick me out? Throw me in the street?" I shook my head. "Number, I won't stoop to what you did to me, but you will find another roof. This house won't carry your debts any longer." For the first time, his eyes softened, just a crack in the armor of his pride. He nodded once, sharply, then turned toward the door. As he stepped out into the night, I called after him. "Jason," he paused. "Cake is sweet, but it's gone in a day. Foundation lasts a lifetime. Learn that, or lose everything again." The door closed behind him with a soft click. The house was quiet, Margaret's picture steady on the mantel. I sank into the armchair, weary but calm. The confrontation was over, not with shouting or fists, but with truth. Jason had wanted to erase me. Instead, he had been erased from the very home he thought was already his. The morning after Jason left my doorstep, I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of me. The early light poured through the curtains, laying golden stripes across the pages. Margaret's handwriting stared back at me, steady and certain as it had been 40 years ago. 1985. Mortgage payment. Final. Paid in full. I traced the words with my finger, feeling the weight of them. Not money, not ink. Sacrifice. Each line of that book was a stone in the foundation of a life we had built together, brick by brick, meal by meal, hour by hour. Jason's laughter at my birthday, the stool at his table, the bitterness in his voice last night, they all felt far away now, like echoes that couldn't touch me anymore. He had mocked me as dead weight, but in truth, I was the weight that had held everything steady. He had wanted the house as inheritance, but what he never understood was that inheritance isn't handed down in papers. It's earned in respect, and respect is the one thing he never gave. I stood and walked the halls of my own home. The walls carried Margaret's touch. The backyard still held the tree we planted when Jason was born. Every board, every nail, every memory was intact. The house hadn't abandoned me. Jason had. And in the end, that was his loss, not mine. By midday, I walked to the porch with a glass of water in hand. Neighbors waved as they passed, some of them already whispering about the auction, the papers, the truth that was now out in the open. I didn't wave them over, didn't tell my side. I didn't need to. Dignity doesn't require explanation. I thought of Margaret then, her soft laugh, her steady words. Don't push what's already leaning, Frank. Just be ready when it falls. She had been right. Jason's life had been leaning for years. All I had done was stand still, steady enough to catch what mattered when it fell. I raised my glass in a quiet toast to the empty air. To you, love. To every sacrifice that wasn't wasted. To truth outlasting lies. The water tasted clean, sharper than any champagne Jason had poured at my birthday. I smiled as the sun warmed my face. Jason had lost his house, his pride, and his illusions. I had regained something more, valuable, my peace, my dignity, my voice. In the end, greed had destroyed itself. Mockery had crumbled into silence, and dignity, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't beg, doesn't fade, stood taller than any insult. That was my revenge. Quiet, complete, undeniable. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories of justice, dignity, and revenge.